and thank you for joining us. My name is Stephanie Junker, and I am the project coordinator for the School Preparedness Program at the University of Pittsburgh Center for Public Health Preparedness. The center trains public health professionals and other professionals to respond to bioterrorism, infectious disease outbreaks, and other public health threats and emergencies. Joining me is Dr. Samuel Stebbins, the center's director, and we will be discussing the H1N1 or swine flu pandemic that is currently underway. This brief informational video is intended for schools and others in the community to help understand and explain the current H1N1 situation. Now let's get started.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'd like to start by thanking everyone who is watching. We hope the information presented here is helpful to you, your families, and your coworkers. Perhaps the most important thing that I can say is that the H1N1 pandemic is a dynamic situation, and it changes to some extent from day to day, so your best defense is to stay informed.
Why is this a pandemic, and what does that mean?
A pandemic is when a new virus or bacteria or other pathogen appears and spreads around the world and causes significant health problems. So this new H1N1 or swine flu virus you've been hearing about qualifies as a pandemic. We think it first started probably in January in 2009 in central Mexico, spread to Mexico City and other parts of Mexico in February and March, and then really started to spread around the world probably in April, which is when we first heard about it. However, unlike other pandemics such as SARS or smallpox, this one does not appear to be nearly as severe.
What makes the H1N1 virus different from seasonal flu?
This is an important question and helps explain why we need to pay attention to it. First, seasonal flu is just that, seasonal. In the United States, we generally only see flu between December and January and March or April. In a pandemic like we're currently experiencing, we get cases in the spring, the summer, the fall, and potentially during the winter. The second is that for seasonal flu, a lot of people will already have some immunity, either from exposure in previous years to similar viruses or because they've had the flu vaccine that year. In this case, almost no one actually has immunity to this virus, so almost everyone is potentially vulnerable. And the third is that the seasonal flu, usually there's just the one season, and pandemics sometimes come in waves. So we had a lot of activity in the spring, we had continued activity over the summer, although it was somewhat quieter, and we're worried that for this fall we may see a lot more cases. And potentially there may be future waves as well, perhaps over the winter or spring.
When will the virus start to make people sick?
The short answer is right now. We're already seeing increasing cases in community settings, and there's a much concern that with schools coming back into line, having started last week or this week, we may see a lot more spread amongst children and then from there to parents and other folks.
How severe will the pandemic be?
This is a very important question. The disease seems frightening when you read and hear about it, but it really helps if you actually talk to folks who've actually had the disease. I've had several colleagues who actually had confirmed H1N1 infections themselves, and it pretty much spread to their entire family. And the symptoms in the family ranged from high fever, fatigue, feeling very tired, needing a lot of rest, to folks who just felt a little under the weather for a day, and they pretty much fell back to normal. So there's a real range of symptoms, and for most of us, it's not that severe. A pandemic never affects all areas equally. There will likely be news reports about some communities, both in the U.S. and internationally, that are hit hard, with lots of illnesses, school closures, and crowded or overwhelmed hospitals. However, many areas may see only sporadic cases and face only minor challenges. This is one of the unknowns, and this is one of the things that we just don't know at this time. This is also why it's important to be prepared. The odds are that you may get infected, and it will probably be mild, but you may also get stuck at home for a week with a house full of sick children, so be prepared with activities for them to do.
How is the virus spread?
There's several ways we know the virus is spread, and some that are still under a little bit of debate. So the most common is what's called droplet spread. And this is where a person sneezes or coughs, doesn't cover their nose and mouth, and droplets fly about 3 to 5 feet and may infect another person who's nearby to them. The second is what's called contact transmission. So if a person sneezes or coughs again on their fingers and they use a computer keyboard or touch a doorknob or some other shared surface, and then someone else comes along, touches that same surface, and then picks their nose or rubs their eyes or bites their fingernails, they may get infected through that. There's debate about what's called airborne spread, which is if someone sneezes or coughs, can flu be spread further than a couple of feet? There may be some cases where that's true, but in general, people feel like that's not an important cause. And then lastly is, what about food and water? At this point, there's no evidence that you can get it through food and water, and certainly not through eating pork, which is sometimes a question that comes up. But it is true that the virus is in saliva, so activities like kissing, sharing cigarettes, sharing utensils is definitely recommended against if at least one person is feeling ill.
Who is getting infected with this virus?
This is one of the key questions again. So it's mostly people between the ages of 5 and 24. There are cases in younger people and in older people, but that's the predominant number of cases. And this is why schools were hit hard in the spring in some places, and why we're concerned that this fall there may be a lot of cases in elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, colleges, and universities. One of the unusual things about this pandemic is that seniors, older folks, are not being infected nearly as much as we would normally expect. This has been something of a question, but appears to be that in the 50s, in the 40s and 50s, there was probably a similar virus circulating. So if you were born before 1957, you may have been exposed to the flu virus at that time, and you may still have antibodies, even 50 years later, that are protecting you. If you're born after 1957, you probably have no protection.
How do I know if I have the H1N1 virus?
Well, in some cases it'll be very clear, but for a lot of people, they may not know. An estimated 1/3 of people who are infected may have very mild or hardly any symptoms at all. For other folks, the most common symptom is probably fever, which can be from low to actually very high, and then either cough or sore throat. Those are the most common three things. People may also have fatigue, muscle aches and pains, and in some cases, vomiting and diarrhea.
How long will I be sick if I do get infected?
It will vary depending on the severity. It may be as short as 2 or 3 days, it may be 5 to 7 days or more. I know a number of years ago when I had a pretty good case of the flu, I had a fever to 104 degrees for 5 consecutive days, and I was completely laid out in bed. And even after that, when I felt a little better and went back to work, it was at least 6 weeks till I felt fully back on my feet. But probably I wasn't contagious once my fever resolved for at least 24 hours.
Should I get tested if I'm sick with the H1N1 virus?
In some cases, that may be the right thing to do. Unfortunately, it may be that enough people are getting sick at the same time that the tests have to be reserved for high-risk folks. So if you're having minor symptoms, you don't need to go to see the doctor. Probably you won't be able to be tested. On the other hand, if you're in the emergency room or in the hospital or severely ill, then testing is probably going to be available for you.
Who is most at risk if they do get infected?
This is really one of the key questions, because although at this point the pandemic is acting pretty much like a seasonal flu virus, so people get mild to moderate illness, and that's often the end of it, there are some people who are being hospitalized and others who are dying. So high-risk groups that we know of at this point include pregnant women in any trimester. Second is kids under the age of 5, especially if they're little kids under the age of 1. Third is people really of any age who have high-risk medical conditions, so which is chronic diseases such as diabetes, asthma, heart disease, kidney disease, things like that. And lastly, seniors. Even though not that many seniors have gotten sick so far, when they do get ill, they are at higher risk of serious complications.